In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled that the key tenets of the Scottish Government's named person scheme were unlawful. 5 years on, we're taking a look back at that long road to victory by speaking to those involved in the successful No to Named Persons campaign. Next up in this series of videos is someone who was heavily involved in the No to Named Persons campaign from the start, Nigel Kenny, the Institute's Scotland officer. Nigel, thank you for talking to me. Your primary role was organising and speaking at meetings, public meetings. What did that involve?
Well, it was a public campaign, and it wasn't just Christians that we wanted to get on board with this. We really wanted, because it was a society-wide concern, every single family in Scotland with a child or children under the age of 18 was going to be impacted by the named person legislation. There was going to be no exceptions, no exemptions at all. It was very, very important that we reach the whole of Scotland. So it was a very, very ambitious campaign. There was a huge reliance that grew and grew over the course of the roughly 2 years that we did, from really sort of late summer 2014 to summer 2016. Over that 2-year period, it was when we did the public meetings. So they would all be advertised on our Facebook page, and as our email list grew, people would be told about the various meetings that were around the country, and we were absolutely everywhere. We were from Stornoway in the Western Isles to Dumfries and Castle Douglas in the south of Scotland. We actually did a meeting in Kirkwall in Orkney, and we were in Kelso and Melrose in the Borders, and everywhere in between. We really did cover the whole of Scotland, and really what was involved was simply using, I say, social media to advertise these meetings. And the early ones, it was a bit of a, we were thinking, is anyone going to come? Because the campaign was really starting from absolutely, standing start. And the first meetings, some of them were struggling to get into double figures, but that was just at the start. But it very much grew as time went on.
There must have come a point, though, at some point where more people were coming along, because there would be some meetings where you had more than 100 people coming along. So was there a specific event which sort of triggered that rise in support, or was it a gradual thing?
Well, certainly we had over 200 at the launch at the MacDonald Holyrood Hotel, right behind very appropriate, right behind the Holyrood Parliament in Edinburgh, and that was great. They were mainly Christians there that we got in touch with from our mailing list. But what we found actually as we were going around the country was it was probably a majority of folk that came to our meetings that wouldn't have been on our mailing list, that wouldn't have had any church connection at all. And that was great. We were delighted, because it showed that all that we were doing on social media was really beginning to pick up, and we were conscious that there were lots and lots of views of the various posts that were being put on social media. I put together a blog piece at the end of every meeting that would go up as well. So there was a huge amount of publicity given to the campaign through that. The word was getting out through every area in the media, and while it was a gradual growth, there was certainly it was organic growth, you might say. Pretty well every meeting had more coming to them. Alongside that, as I'm sure Sam Webster has explained, we had the legal challenge, the judicial review, and that got a huge amount of coverage, including on Reporting Scotland. So of course, if you're getting onto national television, you really are making a name for the campaign. People are getting to hear about it. If national newspapers are running stories, some of the papers would often do front page headline for us, and that just really took off. Once that started happening, we were finding there were more and more people coming to our meetings, and in particular the action days that happened on the back of these meetings. That's one of the reasons why we would go to a particular part of Scotland. Would be the people that would come to these meetings, we know were going to be by and large very much on side, very concerned, and we would encourage them to take a bit of time out on the Saturday morning following to be out in the streets giving out leaflets. We had an online petition that eventually got to over 37,000 signatures, and that was one of the real highlights of the campaign, was just to see people very happy to sign up. We'd sometimes, I think, maybe get 15, 20 volunteers from a meeting, and towards the end of the campaign I was thinking, will there be enough for them to do? But we needed everyone that was there. That as the number of volunteers grew, the interest and the awareness of the general public and the number of signatures to the petition grew and grew organically as well. So it was very, very exciting just to see that gradual but very real organic growth to the campaign.
Now, when you're at a public meeting or when you're out in the streets, obviously you can get a feeling for how the arguments you're using are being received and how people are responding to them. What was the impression you got from both the public meetings and from the action days about how the public felt about the scheme?
Well, people were shocked at really what was happening. State Snoopers, Big Brother, State Surveillance, 1984, these were the terms that were used wherever we went. People really just couldn't believe that there was actually going to be state monitoring of parenting. I remember Gordon Brewer, who one of the Scottish television journalists, asking the government minister, Aileen Campbell, about this fairly early on in the campaign, and it was actually not a phrase that we had used, maybe one that we might not have used, but it was fascinating to see the penny dropping with him, where he said to Aileen Campbell, "There's something a bit East German about this." And I thought that was he's really got it, because that was what East Germany was known for, was for state surveillance of every single family. So once people got to know what it was about, and that it was universal, every single family was going to have one of these named persons appointed. The only people that were excluded were the child's own parents, even if they fitted the role by being a teacher or a health visitor. There had to be someone else coming in, which just showed complete distrust, universal distrust of every single parent in Scotland. I remember Alexander McCall Smith, the Scottish author, writing in his novel, serialised novel 44 Scotland Street. He actually brought the named person scheme into that. And one of the characters in that novel said, could there be a bigger insult that you could actually give to parents than saying, no, we don't trust you to raise your child properly. We're going to have someone that's going to monitor how you're doing, monitor their well-being, which basically they eventually said, well, just means happiness, and more or less tell you what to do, with quite sinister sanctions if parents refuse to take the advice of the named person, and children's panels and things like that. So that there was horrific potential for really unpleasant state interference in ordinary family life. So it was quite easy to get that message across. People didn't take much to be convinced that it was really a very, very concerning thing. And as time went on, and as the media picked up on how dangerous it was, we found that as we were going around the country in our action days, that people were aware of it and were becoming happier to sign the petition to oppose it.
So there was a real sense that the Scottish Government was overreaching itself.
Absolutely, and they were very much on the back foot, and you would find leading Scottish journalists on the BBC grilling Nicola Sturgeon and grilling John Swinney on this, and the government starting to become very much on the back foot to try and explain that. We found it was something of a gift for our videos, because they would end up contradicting themselves. The own politicians themselves would say that it was optional, but then they would say something later to show that it wasn't optional.
What do you think were the arguments which had the most traction with the public?
I think certainly the fact that it was universal, there was no exemptions, the fact that a named person would be appointed without the family's knowledge or consent. Another thing that was always very, very helpful was Leslie Scott, who was such a key speaker within the campaign. She did a tremendous amount of work in advance of every time that we had a meeting. She would actually do her homework and do the research on what each individual local authority for the area that we were speaking in was actually doing with named persons. So it was a different talk every time. It made my job a whole lot easier in terms of writing the vlog piece, because there was no repetition, because it was a new talk every time from her. And she, every time she spoke, she had a list of all the different factors that a named person had to take into account when identifying a wellbeing concern. And I remember she'd have them all kind of partly, the way it works with the old Xerox printers. When you get a huge printout that's loosely kind of connected, each page is connected. She had them all concertina together, and she'd hold them up, and it would all kind of open up and say, this is how many factors have to be taken into account all the time. And that also made people think, well, if this is going to be a health visitor or a teacher or a guidance teacher or a head teacher, where are they going to find the time? They may have maybe 200 pupils or more in the big schools to look after, even if they delegate it to another deputy head or another guidance teacher. It's just a massive, massive workload, additional workload, and that also was an argument that got a lot of traction. It's like, well, we expect these teachers to be actually teaching our children rather than having this massive bureaucratic burden of somehow monitoring the well-being of every child as some kind of substitute parent during school hours. So there was so many different arguments, but I think probably the nutshell was that wherever we went, we found that people just felt it was fundamentally wrong for the state to dictate how they raised their children. In a nutshell, that was the biggest argument, that people just thought, it's up to us as parents, it's not up to the state, and how dare the state think they can do a better job than me? And that just had traction wherever we went. At the start of the campaign, there was only one or two newspapers that got it and were really concerned about the civil liberty aspects. It was a tremendously talented team that we worked with from such a range of different disciplines and backgrounds that really helped a very, very broad and diverse messaging that we could put forward, all sorts of different arguments, that gradually the newspapers actually started to come on board. And so by the time we got to the end of the campaign in summer 2016, you even had the national newspaper, which is the SNP's own newspaper, Vonnie Moy's article there saying, the named person, be careful it doesn't end up happening with children, being taken into care willy-nilly. So you found that pretty well every single major newspaper had something critical to say about this team, and that was, we were amazed, and we really were. But I think it was simply the force of argument, that the arguments were so convincing, and so much effort had been put in by the team to communicate them consistently, week in, week out. It was hardly ever out of the papers. I mean, there was a huge amount of social media work that was done. The message did finally get through to the media. I remember we actually had not just the Mail in Scotland, the Scottish Daily Mail rather, but Daily Mail newspaper journalists from London came up to a meeting we had in Kilmarnock and interviewed one of the people that had come along and did a big piece on it. So that was, we didn't know that was going to happen, but it showed how really the almost the kind of snowball effect of the campaign really it kind of grew arms and legs and just developed a life of its own. And that's what you always hope with a campaign, that it just, almost like the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I think that's the phrase that's used.
And so eventually, of course, as we know, it won big at the Supreme Court. What was your reaction to that? It was. I think it was one of the greatest days of my working life. I mean, it was a team effort, but we were all so passionately behind it, and we knew that all the hopes were pinned on this. The law had been passed with no votes against. There was no possibility of overturning the law through the Parliament. That had been done in 2014, and it was really down to the Supreme Court, and it was an incredible moment. So a successful legal case and a successful campaign, and of course an award-winning campaign as well.
Well, that was the real icing on the cake, because we thought, well, that's job done. We've got the Supreme Court judgment that's been announced, but some kind soul, we still don't know who it was, put our name forward to the Herald newspaper, who have a number of awards that they give, And their panel is full of real kind of movers and shakers in Scottish business and political editing life. And it's quite a, many household names that people would know of, and certainly the organisation's CEOs of household names as well, on the panel that decided who was going to be the Public Campaigner of the Year. And I think there was nothing that amazed me even more perhaps than the Supreme Court victory, was the No to MP campaign actually won the Public Campaigner of the Year award. And I was so delighted, really, for not just the fantastic team that we worked with, but for all the volunteers right across towns and cities in Scotland, the 37,000 plus people that had put their name to that petition. It was their victory. And it was an incredible moment. We were just so delighted, all of us on the team, to have that recognition, really, for the people of Scotland that had got behind the campaign. To have their efforts recognised was a very, very special moment.
Well, I think that's a great point to finish on. So, Nigel, thank you very much for speaking to me today.
Thanks, Angus.